The flight was running smoothly, passengers settling into their seats, the crew moving through their usual routine, when suddenly a sharp, resounding slap shattered the quiet. Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin, heads snapping toward the source of the commotion. A flight attendant stood frozen, her hands still raised, her breathing ragged with fury. And in front of her, an older man sat unmoving, unshaken, his face calm, the fingers wrapped around his cane tightening ever so slightly. She had humiliated him, dismissed him, laid her hands on him. But she had no idea who she had just struck. And by the time this plane touched the ground, her career would be nothing but a memory. Before we dive into this shocking story, comment below where in the world you're watching from. And if you love gripping tales like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what happens next. In the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the expansive glass of the airport terminal, a hush of anticipation mingled with the steady hum of travel chatter and the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases, setting the stage for what seemed like an ordinary flight that would soon shatter every expectation. Among the throng of hurried passengers, Kieran Ross, a dignified, disabled veteran whose life had been etched with the marks of service and sacrifice, moved with measured determination, his worn cane tapping a steady cadence on the polished floor. A cadence that spoke silently of long marches, hard-won battles, and a resolve forged in the crucible of hardship, while his eyes deep and observant revealed secrets of a past laden with both honor and pain, hinting at a depth that belied the quiet exterior of a man accustomed to silently enduring the burdens of his history. As Kieran navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the terminal with an air of quiet resilience, every step exuded a sense of purpose and the unspoken weight of memories from distant battlefields. And though his gait showed the tender scars of time and trial, it was imbued with an inner strength that demanded respect, silently challenging the world to underestimate him. And when he finally arrived at the threshold of the first-class cabin, a realm of understated luxury where every detail from the plush seating to the ambient lighting was meticulously curated to evoke an air of refined exclusivity, there was an immediate and almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, as if the very space itself recognized that an extraordinary story was about to unfold. It was in this charged environment that Emily Harrington, a flight attendant renowned for her unwavering commitment to order and perfection, with a reputation built on a foundation of strict adherence to protocol and a discerning eye that missed nothing, caught sight of Kieran, and in that fleeting moment, her mind, trained to swiftly evaluate every detail against the rigid standards of her domain, registered a dissonance in his appearance, a subtle deviation from the pristine image of a typical first-class traveler, prompting her to cast a critical gaze upon him that was as cold as it was calculated, for the deep lines on his face, the modest streaks of silver in his hair, and the determined yet weary set of his shoulders suggested a life lived far outside the sanitized boundaries of luxury. A life marked by trials and sacrifices that, in her eyes, did not fit the polished mold of those meant to grace her meticulously curated cabin. And as Kieran, with a gentle nod and a quiet dignity that spoke of countless unspoken stories, stepped forward to claim his seat among the elite, the interior of the aircraft, a sanctuary of refined comfort where the scent of freshly brewed coffee intermingled with the subtle aroma of expensive cologne and the soft murmur of hushed conversations, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the imminent clash between two very different worlds. A collision that would soon set into motion a series of events as unpredictable as they were transformative. For unbeknownst to the unassuming veteran, the seemingly mundane process of boarding would soon be marred by a fateful encounter that defied conventional expectations. In the midst of this intricate dance of duty and destiny, before the tension could escalate into irrevocable consequence, take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel for more captivating stories filled with dramatic twists and unexpected revelations that keep you on the edge of your seat. Because what unfolds in the next moments is not merely an exchange of words or a routine check of a boarding pass, but the ignition of a spark that will soon engulf the calm veneer of first-class decorum in a blaze of conflict and consequence, a spark that promises to rewrite the fates of those involved in ways both shocking and profound. For as Kieran gracefully settled into his seat, his quiet demeanor a stark counterpoint to the opulence surrounding him, Emily's steely gaze remained fixed upon him, her mind racing through an internal checklist of discrepancies and deviations from the norm. And with each passing second, her initial suspicion morphed into an unyielding resolve to enforce the rules with an iron fist, convinced that every element of his appearance, the scuffed leather of his jacket, the subtle tremor in his hand as he steadied his cane, and the soft but determined set of his jaw, betrayed a character unworthy of the hallowed status of a first-class passenger. A conclusion drawn not out of personal animosity, but from a rigid commitment to the order and hierarchy that defined her professional existence. And in that singular moment, as the ambient hum of the cabin grew more insistent, and the soft clinking of glassware in the refreshment cart punctuated the unfolding tension, the stage was set for an encounter that promised not only to challenge the established norms of authority and decorum, but also to expose the hidden fissures in the carefully constructed facade of privilege and power. For Kieran, with a quiet strength that belied the burdens of his past, was not merely a traveler seeking comfort in a transient moment of luxury, but a man whose very presence carried the weight of history and the promise of the opulence surrounding him. Emily's steely gaze remained fixed upon him, her mind racing through an internal checklist of discrepancies and deviations from the norm. And with each passing second, her initial suspicion morphed into an unyielding resolve to enforce the rules with an iron fist, convinced that every element of his appearance, the scuffed leather of his jacket, the subtle tremor in his hand as he steadied his cane, and the soft but determined set of his jaw, betrayed a character unworthy of the hallowed status of a first-class passenger. A conclusion drawn not out of personal animosity, but from a rigid commitment to the order and hierarchy that defined her professional existence. And in that singular moment, as the ambient hum of the cabin grew more insistent, and the soft clinking of glassware in the refreshment cart punctuated the unfolding tension, the stage was set for an encounter that promised not only to challenge the established norms of authority and decorum, but also to expose the hidden fissures in the carefully constructed facade of privilege and power. For Kieran, with a quiet strength that belied the burdens of his past, was not merely a traveler seeking comfort in a transient moment of luxury, but a man whose very presence carried the weight of history and the promise of retribution. A promise that would soon upend the delicate balance of power within this microcosm of high society in the skies, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present and setting in motion a chain of events that would resonate far beyond the confines of that opulent cabin, altering destinies and forcing each soul to confront the stark realities of judgment, pride, and the irrevocable consequences of misplaced authority. And as the aircraft's engines began to stir, their deep, resonant hum blending with the anticipatory silence of the first-class compartment, the dichotomy between Kieran's quiet resilience and Emily's rigid determination became ever more pronounced, each element of the scene laden with an unspoken promise that the collision of their worlds would soon become a tempest of drama, emotion, and unforeseen consequences. A tempest that would challenge the very foundations of power and decorum in a realm where every detail was meticulously controlled, yet where in this instance the natural force of human spirit was poised to shatter the constraints of convention in an explosion of retribution and revelation, leaving all who bore witness to this fateful encounter forever changed, as the aircraft prepared to take flight into a future laden with uncertainty and the haunting memory of a moment when destiny itself had chosen to intervene. The first-class cabin was frozen in the aftermath of the slap, passengers exchanging nervous glances, uncertain whether they had actually witnessed what they just did. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke the entire cabin in silence, but Emily Harrington didn't seem to notice. Or rather, she refused to acknowledge it. She had spent years commanding authority in the air, making split-second decisions that no one dared to question. To her, she was always right. And right now, she was convinced that the old man sitting in a first class was the one in the wrong. Her breath came out sharp, nostrils flaring as she squared her shoulders, standing over Kieran Ross like she was preparing for battle, unaware that she had already lost. Kieran, on the other hand, had not moved. He didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. Instead, his grip around his cane tightened just slightly, a barely noticeable shift in his demeanor, but one that held the weight of something much heavier. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't even angry. He was just watching her, waiting. The kind of patience that made the air feel heavier, that made those who thought they had power suddenly realize they never did. Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The hush in the cabin stretched unbearably long, but Emily didn't take it as a warning. Instead, she doubled down. "Sir," she snapped, her voice now clipped, sharp enough to cut through the murmurs that had started up behind her. "I told you to move to economy." Her words came with the same confidence of someone who had never been challenged before. Someone who had spent years making assumptions and getting away with it. She was used to people backing down, caving under her authority. But Kieran did not. He simply tilted his head slightly as if considering her words before letting out a slow, measured breath. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Too quiet. "Miss Harrington," he said, and the way he said her name. Not ma'am, not flight attendant, not you. But her name made her shoulders tense involuntarily. "I'm going to give you one last chance to correct yourself." The shift in the air was immediate. Passengers stiffened. Even Noah Reed, the younger flight attendant standing just outside the galley, looked like he had stopped breathing. Emily's brows twitched, eyes narrowing into thin slits as she let out a humorless huff. "Vadioy!" "Excuse me?" she scoffed. "You're giving me a chance?" The arrogance in her voice was thick. Thick enough that some passengers visibly recoiled at the sheer audacity of it. Kieran, however, did not move. He simply raised his ticket again, holding it between two fingers, as if to remind her that this conversation should have never happened in the first place. The ticket, the indisputable proof that he belonged here, hovered between them like a final, unspoken warning. Emily, however, was too far gone to see it. "You need to stop wasting my time," she said, her voice now clipped, sharp as a blade. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but I'm telling you right now, you need to leave before I call security." The words were barely out of her mouth before a deep voice from the front row scoffed loudly. "You've got to be kidding me," Nathan Clark, the businessman seated just ahead of Kieran, muttered as he finally twisted in his seat to fully face them. He had been watching this unfold with mild amusement at first, but the moment the slap landed, his expression had shifted to something much colder. "Lady, do you hear yourself?" he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You think this man just walked onto the plane and took a random first-class seat?" His voice carried, drawing more attention, making it even harder for Emily to pretend like no one else was watching. Her jaw twitched, irritation flashing across her face as she threw Nathan a withering glare. "Sir, this does not concern you," she said firmly, her tone making it clear that she wasn't about to tolerate interference. Nathan only chuckled, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair as he leaned back into his seat. "Oh, I think it does," he said, his smirk widening just slightly. "Because you just hit a paying passenger. I'm guessing that breaks a whole lot of policies, huh?" Emily's face flushed red. Whether it was from anger or realization, it was hard to tell. She glanced quickly around the cabin, and that's when it finally seemed to sink in. People were watching. Some had their phones out, screens glowing faintly as if they had just started recording. The whispers had grown louder. There was no way to pretend like this hadn't happened now. Still, she refused to back down. "I am simply enforcing airline regulations," she said, her voice now much tighter, strained. Kieran let out a small breath, almost like he was tired. Not angry, not frustrated, just tired. "Miss Harrington," he said again, voice still steady, still calm, still terrifyingly in control. "I suggest you let go of my cane before you regret it." Emily hadn't even realized she was still gripping it. Her fingers had tightened around the wooden handle at some point, as if by taking it, she could take control of the situation. But now, with every single pair of eyes in first class locked onto her, she felt something she hadn't felt before. Unease. She let go. The second she did, Kieran adjusted his grip, rolling his shoulders back slowly, deliberately in a way that made her realize he wasn't just another old man. There was something dangerous beneath the surface, something that had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with class, but everything to do with power. The kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind of power that simply exists. The silence stretched unbearably long between them before the intercom crackled. A deep, authoritative voice filled the cabin. "Miss Harrington, report to the cockpit immediately." Emily stiffened. She blinked, the color in her face draining slightly. For the first time since this began, she hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the front of the plane, where the cockpit door loomed like a judgment call she had been trying to avoid. A cold chill crept down her spine. Something was wrong. She turned back toward Kieran, but his expression hadn't changed. Calm, controlled, waiting. But now there was something else there, too. Finality? Nathan Clark smirked again, shaking his head as he grabbed his drink from the tray beside him, taking a leisurely sip before murmuring under his breath, "Oh, she's done." Emily's fingers twitched at her sides. She still didn't understand why she was being called forward, but something about the way Kieran hadn't even reacted. Hadn't fought, hadn't argued, hadn't done anything but wait, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Kieran just nodded once, and Emily Harrington turned toward the cockpit, walking toward the beginning of the end. Emily's heels clicked against the carpeted aisle as she stormed toward the cockpit, her breath coming out in short, irritated bursts, her heart pounding against her ribcage, though she refused to acknowledge the reason why. She had been called to the cockpit before, but never like this. Never with an entire cabin full of passengers staring after her. Never with a gnawing unease curling in her stomach. Never with the sensation that she had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. She clenched her fists, forcing her face into the same unreadable mask she always wore when dealing with difficult situations. This was just another problem to be handled. Another defiant passenger who needed to be put in their place. Another moment where she could reassert her control. That was what she told herself, but deep down, something felt different this time. The way that man, Kieran Ross, had looked at her. Not with fear, not with anger, but with patience. Like he was waiting for something. The intercom crackled again. "Miss Harrington, report to the cockpit immediately." Her stomach twisted at the firmness of the voice. Captain Lawrence Bishop wasn't a man to waste words. If he was calling her twice, it meant something was happening, something she wasn't prepared for. But Emily had never allowed herself to be unprepared. She straightened her uniform, lifted her chin, and walked faster. She pushed through the curtain separating first class from the cockpit, her irritation barely concealed as she knocked twice on the door, then pushed it open without waiting for permission. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was very, very wrong. Captain Bishop was sitting in his chair, his face blank, unreadable but tense, his fingers drumming lightly against the console. That alone wasn't what made her breath catch. It was the second figure in the room. The aircraft's communication screen was on, displaying a live video feed of Grayson Langford, one of the highest-ranking airline executives. The man who answered directly to the owner of the airline. Emily's throat went dry. She had spoken to corporate before, had even been commended for her strict adherence to professionalism in the past, but this? Executives didn't involve themselves unless something serious had happened. She kept her expression cool, even as she felt a thin bead of sweat forming at the base of her neck. "You called for me, Captain?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Captain Bishop said nothing. Instead, Grayson Langford leaned slightly forward, his expression unreadable as he studied her through the screen. his sharp eyes scanning her face, his silence somehow more oppressive than any reprimand could have been. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Harrington," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to have a conversation about what just happened in first class." The air inside the cockpit seemed to thicken. Emily forced herself not to shift under his gaze. "I was enforcing airline policy," she said smoothly. "A passenger attempted to take a first-class seat that I believed was not his. I acted accordingly." Captain Bishop exhaled sharply, as if he expected this answer, and was already exhausted by it. But it was Grayson Langford's response that sent a chill down her spine. "You believed?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. Emily hated the way he said it, slowly, deliberately, like she had walked into a trap that she hadn't even seen. Emily straightened her posture. "Yes, sir, I checked his ticket, and while it initially appeared valid, I had reason to believe it was a mistake. I followed protocol." "Did that protocol include physically assaulting a passenger?" Grayson's voice sliced through her words like a knife. Emily felt her stomach drop. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "We reviewed the security footage," Captain Bishop added, his voice tight with disapproval. "He presented a perfectly valid ticket at the gate, and there was never an issue in the system. The mistake, Miss Harrington, was yours." Emily's nails dug into the fabric of her uniform. "Sir, And yet," Grayson cut in, his voice colder now, "instead of acknowledging that mistake, you escalated. You humiliated him. You put your hands on him. And you did all of this in front of first-class passengers, many of whom are already reaching out to corporate as we speak." Emily's face drained of color. She had assumed the businessman, Nathan Clark, would be an annoyance, but she hadn't considered that others would complain too. She hadn't thought it would reach corporate this quickly. This wasn't just an internal matter anymore, it was a disaster unfolding in real time. And yet, even with the weight of that realization settling into her chest, she still wasn't ready to back down. "With all due respect, sir," she said, grasping for control, "I was following my instincts. I was trying to prevent fraud." "Fraud?" Grayson's voice sharpened, cutting her off instantly. "Miss Harrington, do you have any idea who that passenger is?" Emily blinked, caught off guard. Her mind raced. Was he some kind of celebrity? A politician? A tech mogul? Before she could answer, Grayson continued. "That man is Kieran Ross," he said slowly, letting the name hang in the air. "One of the founding investors of this airline." Emily's heart stopped. The words hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She had heard the name before, everyone in the company had. Kieran Ross was one of the original financial backers of the airline. A decorated war hero. A man who had been instrumental in the company's success, and she had slapped him. Emily's mouth went dry. You didn't just slap a passenger, Miss Harrington." Grayson's voice was icy, absolute. "You slapped a man who has the power to end your career before this plane even lands?" The reality of the situation crashed into her like a freight train. This wasn't a misunderstanding she could explain away. This wasn't a minor reprimand she could talk herself out of. She had crossed a line. And worse, she had crossed it with the worst possible person. Captain Bishop leaned forward, his expression grim. "You are to return to first class immediately," he ordered. "You will apologize to Mr. Ross publicly. And when this plane lands, you will report directly to the corporate office for an internal review." Emily barely heard the rest. She felt like she was sinking, like the world had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. Like everything she had spent years building was collapsing all at once. But she didn't move. She couldn't move, not until Grayson Langford delivered the final blow. "And Miss Harrington," he said, his voice almost bored now. "Given the circumstances, I wouldn't expect to be wearing that uniform much longer." Her knees nearly buckled. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of the engines rumbled, the steady beat of a plane flying at 30,000 feet. But for Emily Harrington, it might as well have been the sound of her world crashing down. And the worst part? It was only just beginning. Emily's body felt stiff as she stormed out of the cockpit, her mind racing, her pulse pounding in her ears so loud she could barely hear anything else. Kieran Ross, a founding investor, a man with enough power to erase her career with a single phone call. The realization hit her in waves, each one crashing harder than the last, and yet, she still couldn't fully process it. Her body moved on instinct, her heels clicking against the carpet as she marched back toward first class, the space where she had been so sure of her authority just minutes ago. But now it felt different. It felt smaller, suffocating. Passengers were watching. She could feel their silent, knowing stares, the weight of their judgment pressing against her like an unbearable force. And worst of all, Kieran Ross was still sitting exactly where she left him, completely unshaken. Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what happens next. His cane rested beside him, his posture unmoved, controlled, like he had been waiting for her return this entire time. Like he already knew how this was going to end. Emily inhaled sharply, steeling herself as she forced her voice into a rehearsed, professional tone. "Mr. Ross," she began, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, "I'd like to offer my sincerest—" Kieran raised a hand. Not fast, not aggressively, but with the kind of quiet command that made her immediately fall silent. "Say it like you mean it," he said simply. His voice was calm, measured, unshaken. Emily's teeth clenched so hard it hurt. She could feel the heat of humiliation burning under her skin, the eyes of first-class passengers drilling into her. She had never had to do this before. Apologize. At least not in a way that actually mattered. She had given countless empty, corporate-mandated apologies before, smiling, nodding, and moving on without a second thought. But this was different. She could feel it. The power in the room had shifted. She swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," she forced out, the words thick on her tongue, foreign and unnatural. "I should not have questioned your ticket, and I definitely should not have put my hands on you." Silence. Kieran just studied her, waiting. His lack of reaction was worse than anger. Worse than anything she had expected. She wanted him to snap at her, to yell, to threaten, to give her something to push back against. But instead, he just watched, judging, evaluating. "And?" he prompted. Emily felt her stomach drop. "And I regret my actions," she added quickly, though even she didn't believe the words. Kieran let out a slow, deliberate exhale, finally leaning back in his seat, fingers drumming lightly against the head of his cane. The pause stretched unbearably long, until finally he tilted his head just slightly. "Not good enough," he said, "but it'll do for now." A ripple of quiet amusement spread through the cabin. Nathan Clark let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he took a sip of his drink, watching Emily with thinly veiled amusement. Across the aisle, Lena Whitmore, the woman who had gasped earlier, let out a quiet scoff of disbelief. "She really thought she could get away with that," Lena muttered under her breath. Emily's entire body burned with humiliation. She had lost. Completely. And the worst part? This wasn't even the end. She turned on her heel, desperate to escape back to the galley, to regain some semblance of control. But before she could take a single step, Kieran spoke again. "One more thing." She froze, her spine going rigid. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned back to face him, forcing her expression into neutral professionalism. "Yes, sir," she bit out, the words tasting like poison. Kieran didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just stared at her. "I want you to think about this moment when you land," he said, his voice even, unshaken. "Because this—" His eyes didn't waver. "This isn't going away." A cold chill ran down her spine. She didn't know what that meant. Not exactly, but something deep in her gut told her. This wasn't just about losing her job. This was about losing everything. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to hammer in the final nail, the intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received updated instructions from corporate regarding a seating matter in first class. Flight crew, please ensure all passengers remain in their assigned seats. The soft murmur of the cabin died instantly. Passengers weren't stupid. That wasn't a normal announcement. That wasn't about safety or turbulence. That was about her. Emily felt her legs go weak. Corporate was already handling this. Her fate was already being decided. She turned stiffly, forcing herself to walk back to the galley, every step heavier than the last. She had spent years owning this space, controlling every aspect of her flights, demanding respect, obedience, power. But now she was the one being ordered around. She barely made it past the curtain before she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white, her breathing uneven. Noah Reed, the younger flight attendant, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her. That didn't go well, did it? Emily shot him a sharp look. Not now, Reed. But Noah didn't back down. I told you earlier, he said, his voice low, unreadable. You should have left that man alone. Emily let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you understand how this works? Noah took a small step forward, his gaze steady. I think I understand enough, he said simply. I think I understand that you just slapped a man who owns part of this airline. And I think you're done. Emily opened her mouth to snap back, but before she could, the in-flight system chimed again. Flight crew, prepare for landing. Her stomach dropped. The last 20 minutes in the air were the only thing keeping her from what was waiting on the ground, and now there was nothing left between her and the inevitable. Emily straightened her uniform, breathing through her nose, trying to push down the crushing sense of dread. She wasn't going down without a fight, but for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she could win. And for the first time in her life, she felt something she had never felt before. Fear. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of passengers shifting in their seats, adjusting their seatbelts and preparing for descent, but for Emily Harrington, every second felt like the slow march toward an execution. The moment the captain's voice had announced the updated instructions from corporate, her stomach had twisted into an unbearable knot, and now, as the plane began its slow, steady descent, reality was closing in around her like a steel trap. She stood rigidly in the galley, her hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white, her mind scrambling for a way out, an escape, a miracle that wasn't coming. This was a mistake. It had to be. She had been with this airline for years, had built a career on her authority, her discipline, her ability to control a cabin with nothing but her presence. And now? Now she was reduced to nothing more than a flight attendant who had lost control, a name on a corporate review list, a pending termination notice waiting to be filed. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, her heart hammering in her chest as she flicked her gaze toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, resisting the urge to pull it back and look at Kieran Ross. He was still seated, still relaxed, still completely unfazed. That man, the one she had dismissed, the one she had put her hands on, hadn't said a single word to corporate, hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, hadn't done anything but exist. And yet, he was ruining her. Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what happens next. Her throat burned with humiliation. For years, Emily had dictated the rules of first class. She had been the one to decide who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. She had spent years glancing at people and instantly determining their worth. The businessmen who barely acknowledged her but still deserved top-tier service. The celebrities who expected perfection. The old money elite who could afford to be rude because they knew no one would ever question them. And then there were the others. The ones who didn't look like they belonged. The ones she assumed didn't deserve to be there. Kieran Ross had been one of those people in her eyes, just another old man, another economy passenger who had somehow slipped past the system, another inconvenience. And yet, he was none of those things. He was the system, and she had made the worst mistake of her career by assuming otherwise. She forced herself to take a deep breath, her chest tight with frustration and something dangerously close to fear. She could feel Noah Reed's eyes on her from across the galley, the young flight attendant leaning casually against the counter, arms crossed, watching her unravel with thinly veiled curiosity. He hadn't said anything in the last few minutes, but he didn't need to. His silence was enough because he knew exactly how this was going to end, just like every other passenger in first class who had been watching her fall apart in real time. Emily clenched her jaw, lifting her chin slightly, refusing to let anyone see the way her hands trembled at her sides. No, she wasn't going down like this. She had handled far worse situations. Unruly passengers, emergency landings, corporate audits, even a lawsuit once. But this was nothing. She would talk her way out of it. She would get ahead of it. Corporate wasn't going to fire her like over one incident. She was too valuable, too experienced, too important to be discarded over a misunderstanding. And that's what this was, a misunderstanding. If she framed it right, if she spun it well enough, if she made them see that she had only been trying to enforce airline policy, then maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. She sucked in a sharp breath, straightened her uniform, and turned toward Noah, ready to regain even the smallest bit of control. But before she could even open her mouth, he shook his head, a quiet smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Don't bother," he said, his voice almost amused, almost pitying. "You're not talking your way out of this one." Emily stiffened. "Excuse me?" she snapped, but Noah just shrugged. "You heard me," he said, tilting his head slightly, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "This isn't a conversation you can control anymore. You lost that the second you put your hands on him." His words sent a sharp jolt through her chest, but she refused to let it show. "I was following protocol," she hissed, but even as she said it, the words tasted like a lie. Noah let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" He gestured toward the first-class cabin. "That man? You think he's just some random passenger? You think this is just about a first-class seat?" He let out a small, almost disappointed laugh. "You made a mistake. And now, for the first time, you actually have to answer for it." The words hit harder than she wanted to admit. Emily opened her mouth to snap back, to say something, anything, but before she could, the intercom crackled again. "Flight crew, prepare for landing." Her stomach plummeted. That was it. Her last few minutes of safety in the air were gone. She was going to land, and when she did, she knew what was waiting for her. The moment she stepped off this plane, she would walk straight into the hands of corporate. There would be a meeting, an investigation, an internal review. There would be questions she wouldn't have answers to, evidence she wouldn't be able to refute. There would be Kieran Ross, sitting in some executive office making the final call on whether she ever worked in aviation again. And for the first time in her life, Emily Harrington didn't feel powerful. She felt terrified. The landing gear rumbled beneath her feet, the soft jolt of the plane touching the runway, sending shockwaves through her system. The moment the wheels hit the ground, it was over. She had spent her entire career controlling first class. But now? Now she was the one being escorted out. The plane rolled to a stop, the cabin filled with the usual sounds of passengers shifting in their seats, unbuckling their seatbelts, reaching for their overhead luggage. But for Emily Harrington, every movement felt deafening, like the final moments before an execution. She sat frozen in the galley, her back pressed against the counter, her fingers digging into the edge as if anchoring herself to something, anything that wouldn't let her fall. But she was already falling. And she knew it. The final chime of the intercom came like a death sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off." The words sounded routine, mundane. But to Emily, they might as well have been announcing the end of her entire life. She barely registered the murmurs of passengers, the hushed conversations from first-class travelers who had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see what would happen next. Because they all knew something was coming, and so did she. Then, through the tiny gap in the curtain leading to the front of the plane, she saw them, the men in suits, the security officers, the airline representatives, waiting for her. Her stomach twisted violently, but she didn't move. Not yet. Because she knew the moment she stepped out of this galley, the moment she walked back into first class, she wouldn't be the same person she was when this flight took off. Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what happens next. She forced herself to take a deep breath, but it wasn't steady. Her hands trembled as she smoothed down the front of her uniform, her mind racing with last-minute strategies, ways to explain, ways to defend herself, ways to salvage even a shred of control. But the truth was, there was no fixing this. The moment she had slapped Kieran Ross, it was already over. The moment she had ignored his ticket, dismissed his presence, yanked his cane, and humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of witnesses, she had signed her own termination notice. And she hadn't even realized it at the time. She had spent her whole career believing that she was untouchable, that no one could challenge her, that first class belonged to her. But now, as she took a slow step forward, pushing past the curtain and stepping into the aisle, all of first class was watching her. Their gazes weren't filled with sympathy. They weren't even surprised. They were waiting for her to be escorted off the plane. Kieran Ross hadn't moved. He was still seated, his hands resting lightly on his cane, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't say a single word, but his presence alone made it clear. She had lost. Emily felt the heat rise up her neck, humiliation curling in her stomach like something venomous. She wanted to look anywhere but at him, but she couldn't. Because just like every other passenger in that cabin, she knew that this was his moment. This was the moment he had waited for, not to humiliate her, not to yell, not to ruin her out of spite, but to simply let her realize that she had done this to herself. She squared her shoulders, forcing herself to keep her head high, forcing herself to pretend she wasn't crumbling under the weight of what was happening. But as she took another step forward, past the first row of seats, she heard it, the whispers. Is that her? She really thought she could get away with it. Corporate's gonna bury her. She deserves it. Emily's fingers curled into fists. She wanted to snap at them, to tell them to mind their own business, to remind them that they had no idea who she was. But that was the problem, wasn't it? They did know. They knew exactly who she was. They had seen her for what she really was. Someone who had spent her career deciding who was worthy of respect and who wasn't, and now she was on the receiving end of her own judgment. She had been the one who determined who deserved to be in first class, who got treated like royalty, and who got treated like a nuisance. But today? Today, she was the nuisance. And Kieran Ross? He was the one who decided her fate. The security officers stepped forward, their presence towering over her, their expressions neutral, but their message clear. Miss Harrington, one of them said, you'll be coming with us. She felt like she had been slapped all over again. For so long, she had been the one giving orders, making the rules, deciding who got to stay and who got to go. And now she was the one being removed, escorted like a disruptive passenger, stripped of her authority, her power, her career. She turned stiffly, not daring to look at Kieran again, because she knew, if she did, she'd see it in his eyes. The finality, the undeniable truth that she had been the one to ruin herself. The silence in first class was deafening. No one moved. No one even pretended to check their phones or adjust their seats. They just watched her final moments in the career she had spent years building. And then Nathan Clark, the businessman in the front row, let out a slow, amused exhale. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's gotta hurt." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the cabin. Emily's face burned. Her nails dug into her palms as she took another step forward. She wanted to scream, to yell, to fight, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. Nothing she said now would matter. The flight attendants near the galley refused to look at her. Noah Reed, however. He watched her go, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. But as she passed him, he finally spoke. "Told you," he murmured, just loud. Enough for her to hear. Emily clenched her teeth. She reached the front of the plane. Grayson Langford, the airline executive, was there waiting for her. His expression was calm, cold, professional. He barely acknowledged her. Barely even looked at her. To him, she was already gone. The security officer gestured toward the jet bridge. "This way, Miss Harrington." Emily took one final look at first class. She had spent years believing she was the most important person on this plane. But now, she was nothing more than a lesson for the next flight attendant who thought they were untouchable. She stepped off the plane, the doors hissing shut behind her. And just like that, Emily Harrington was gone. Emily's heels clicked against the cold, polished floor of the jet bridge, each step feeling heavier than the last, her breath sharp and uneven, her uniform suddenly suffocating around her, as if the fabric itself was squeezing the air from her lungs. The moment she crossed the threshold stepping off the plane, she felt it, the weight of finality, the creeping, unrelenting sense of doom that settled into her bones like ice. There was no going back. The door to the aircraft, her domain, her kingdom, her territory, had closed behind her, and she had no power to open it again. She forced her chin up, squared her shoulders, gritted her teeth, but it didn't matter. She wasn't in control anymore. She could feel the presence of the security officers flanking her, walking just close enough to remind her that she wasn't being escorted as a respected senior flight attendant, but as a liability, a problem that needed to be handled before it infected the airline's pristine image. The walls of the terminal felt too bright, too clean, too foreign. This was the same airport she had walked through thousands of times, yet now it felt like she no longer belonged here. Because she didn't. And just ahead, waiting for her like a silent executioner, stood Grayson Langford, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly in front of him as if he had already decided her fate before she had even stepped off that plane. Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what happens next. She slowed barely, but the security officer to her right gently nudged her forward. A subtle but humiliating reminder that she wasn't in charge here. She had given orders to countless passengers before, ordering them back to their seats, demanding compliance, issuing final warnings to those who dared to challenge her. Now, she was the one being handled, the one whose authority had been stripped so completely that it made her skin crawl. Grayson didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, the way a doctor might examine a patient who had already been declared terminal, the way someone might assess a broken object before deciding whether it was even worth repairing. Then, without preamble, he gestured toward the hallway behind him. "Walk." His voice was calm, controlled, final. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears, her stomach twisting as she realized exactly where he was taking her. Not to a meeting room, not to a quiet, private conversation where she could explain herself. No, she was being led to a conference room right in the heart of the corporate wing, a place where disciplinary hearings happened, a place where careers ended. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her steps steady, but she could already feel the sting of prying eyes. Other airline employees, crew members, supervisors, managers were watching from a distance, whispering, glancing at each other with knowing looks. They all recognized her. They all knew what was happening. And that was the worst part. No one was surprised, because they had seen this coming long before she had. She had spent years walking through these halls, her uniform crisp, her chin lifted, her expression cool and composed. She had spent years sneering at the flight attendants who got pulled aside, the ones who had to take the long, shameful walk toward their disciplinary meetings, the ones who had pushed too far and lost. And now she was the one on display. The conference room loomed ahead, its glass walls revealing exactly what was inside. Grayson Langford's assistant, waiting with a thick folder of paperwork. And next to her, sitting with the same unshaken patience he had displayed the entire flight, was Kieran Ross. Emily stopped in her tracks. She had assumed he would be long gone by now. She had hoped he would be. That he had made his point, humiliated her enough, and moved on with his life. But no, he was here. Sitting there as if he had all the time in the world, as if this was just another minor business matter to attend to before he continued on with his day. As if ruining her career was nothing more than an inconvenience he had been forced to deal with. Her stomach churned with something that felt like rage, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't afford to lose it here. Grayson pushed open the glass door. Inside, Emily hesitated for just a second, then stepped inside, her knees locking to keep herself standing tall. The door shut behind her with a soft click, and suddenly it was too quiet. She didn't sit. She wouldn't sit. Because the moment she did, it would feel real. Grayson didn't care. He moved past her, settling into his seat across from Kieran, flipping open the folder, skimming its contents as if this was just another day at work. "Miss Harrington," he said without looking up, "as of this moment, you are suspended without pay pending termination." A sharp spike of panic shot through her, but she didn't react. Not yet. She had expected a suspension, but termination? Number she could talk her way out of this. She could argue, negotiate, appeal. Then Kieran Ross finally spoke. "You didn't make a mistake," he said, his voice as calm and measured as ever. "You made a choice." And suddenly, Emily felt like she had been hit in the chest with a freight train. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but she had nothing. Because he was right. Every moment on that flight had been a choice. She had chosen to ignore his ticket. She had chosen to escalate the situation. She had chosen to put her hands on him, and now she had to live with the consequences. Grayson closed the folder with a quiet thud. "You will be permanently removed from this airline's employment roster," he said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "And this incident will be reported to aviation regulators." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just about this job. This was about every job. She wasn't just losing her position, she was being erased. Kieran stood slowly adjusting his grip on his cane, looking at her one last time. Not with hatred, not with satisfaction, but with the kind of quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any words ever could. And then, just as Grayson nodded to security, just as they stepped forward to remove her from the room, Kieran spoke one last time. "You don't belong in the sky." And with that, Emily Harrington's career was over. Emily could feel her heartbeat in her throat, pounding so violently it drowned out the words still echoing in her head. "You don't belong in the sky." The sentence clung to her like a stain she couldn't wash off, a final nail in the coffin of the career she had built with her own two hands. But she refused to accept it. Not yet. Not when there was still breath in her lungs. Not when she still had a chance to argue, to plead, to fix this. Her entire life had been dedicated to this industry, to the power she had cultivated, to the unwavering authority she had wielded over flight crews and passengers alike. She was Emily Harrington, the woman who dictated order in first class, the one who decided who was worthy and who wasn't. And now she was being told she was nothing? Number it couldn't end this way. Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what happens next. But even as the defiance burned inside her, her body betrayed her. Her knees felt weak, Her stomach coiled so tightly she thought she might be sick, her palms damp with sweat as she clenched her fists at her sides. She wanted to stand tall, to maintain even a shred of dignity, but she could feel herself unraveling, because this wasn't a suspension. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was the end. Her gaze flicked toward Kieran Ross, praying for some kind of lifeline, some crack in his stoic exterior that told her there was room for negotiation. But he was already standing, his cane balanced in his grip, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry, he wasn't smug, and that made it so much worse. He was simply finished with her. That realization hit harder than she expected. If he had yelled, if he had humiliated her further, if he had raged about her behavior, she might have had something to cling to, some way to fight back. But this quiet dismissal, it was unbearable. It meant he had already decided she was beneath his concern. "Wait," she blurted, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. I can fix this." Grayson Langford, who had been methodically reviewing the paperwork in front of him, didn't even bother to look up. "No, Miss Harrington, you can't." Her jaw clenched. "I've given years to this airline. Years." She forced herself to steady her breathing, desperate to reclaim control of the conversation. "I understand what happened on the flight was regrettable, but this is excessive. You're reacting based on emotion, not logic." Kieran tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite place. "Emotion?" he repeated. "You think this is about emotion?" He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. This is about accountability." Emily felt her stomach drop. "Your actions didn't just affect you." Grayson cut in smoothly, finally meeting her gaze with the cold detachment of a man who had handed down too many terminations to count. They affected the passengers, the flight crew, and most importantly, this airline's reputation. You laid hands on a passenger. You escalated a situation that should never have been a situation to begin with. You were given multiple chances to de-escalate, and instead, you doubled down. Emily's nails dug into the fabric of her uniform. "You're punishing me for something flight attendants do every day," she snapped. "I've seen worse on other flights from other crew members. I've handled worse." Grayson's lips pressed together. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but those flight attendants didn't make the mistake of putting their hands on an investor who owns a significant stake in this company." Her entire body turned ice cold. That was it. That was the real reason this was happening. It wasn't about her behavior. It wasn't about the so-called accountability they wanted to enforce. It was about the fact that she had dared to mistreat the wrong passenger. If Kieran Ross had been anyone else, if he had been just another businessman or retiree, she wouldn't be in this room right now. "This isn't about policy," she said, her voice bitter. "This is about politics." Grayson didn't confirm or deny it. He simply gestured toward the paperwork on the table. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," and he said. "A report will be filed with aviation regulators. Any attempts to apply for another airline will require full disclosure of this incident." Emily stared at the documents in front of her. She wasn't just being fired. She was being erased. Her fingers curled against her palm. "This isn't fair," she whispered. Kieran stepped forward then, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "Fair?" He shook his head. "Miss Harrington, you've spent your entire career deciding who deserved respect and who didn't. You've made passengers feel small. You've dismissed people based on your own biases. And today you did it to the wrong person." She flinched. Kieran leaned in slightly. "Do you know why I didn't yell? Do you know why I didn't fight you back when you tried to humiliate me?" His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was an edge beneath it. A blade so sharp it didn't need to be swung to cut. Emily swallowed. "Why?" she forced out. Kieran gave her a slow, measured look. Because I knew you would destroy yourself. The words landed like a hammer to her chest. She swayed slightly, her throat dry, her face burning. Because deep down she knew he was right. She had done this to herself. The arrogance, the refusal to back down, the unwillingness to admit she had been wrong. All of it had led to this moment. Kieran Ross hadn't ruined her. She had. Grayson stood then, stacking the paperwork neatly. Security will escort you out. Emily's breath hitched. Wait! But there was no waiting. The door behind her opened, and two uniformed security officers stepped inside. One of them gestured toward the exit. Miss Harrington. She couldn't move. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do. She had spent years commanding authority, years deciding who got to stay and who had to leave, years believing she was the most important person in any room she walked into. But now? Now she was just another name on a termination report. She forced herself to move, her legs feeling like lead as she turned toward the door. She didn't look at Kieran again. She couldn't, because she knew deep down that she had been nothing more than a cautionary tale waiting to happen. She had just never seen it coming. Emily Harrington's world was crumbling beneath her feet, yet she still tried to walk with the same dignity she had always carried through these halls. But it was a lie, a desperate illusion she clung to even as she felt the weight of her downfall pressing down on her chest, making every breath harder to take. Her heart pounded violently, her ears ringing as if the walls of the airport were closing in on her. She had walked through this terminal countless times, her head held high, her uniform crisp, her presence commanding respect without the need for words. Now no one even looked at her. Not out of ignorance, but because they already knew. Word had traveled fast. It always did. The airline industry was ruthless, a world where rumors spread faster than the speed of sound, and she could already see it. The quiet glances exchanged between flight attendants passing by, the hushed whispers from ground crew workers pretending to check their tablets, the way some employees actively avoided eye contact as if her failure was contagious. And in the distance, through the glass walls of the executive wing, she saw them. Other managers, supervisors, people she had worked alongside for years, watching as she was escorted out like a common criminal. The security officers flanked her, their presence looming over her like a silent confirmation that she was no longer part of this world. And that was the hardest part. Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what happens next. Her shoes clicked against the tile floor, the sound eerily similar to the sharp, confident steps she had always taken when she commanded this space. But there was no confidence in her stride now. Every step was laced with humiliation, with the realization that she wasn't walking toward her next flight assignment, her next first-class service, her next round of passive-aggressive smiles directed at passengers who didn't meet her unspoken standards. Number. She was walking toward the exit. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had spent years enforcing rules, deciding who was worthy of respect, making passengers and crew alike bend to her authority. And now she was the one being removed. Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, forcing herself to maintain the facade to hold on to the last fragments of her pride. She wasn't going to cry. She refused to. But then she saw Noah Reed. The young flight attendant stood near the employee lounge entrance, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had been there, had seen everything unravel on that flight, had tried to warn her before she had crossed the line. And now? Now he just watched her go. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. That somehow made it worse. Because in his eyes, she wasn't an enemy, she was just pathetic. And for the first time in her career, Emily felt small. She tried to keep walking, tried to ignore the shame curling in her stomach. But Noah took a slow step forward, his voice low and even. "I told you," he murmured. Not with malice, but with a quiet inevitability. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her nails digging into her palms so hard they left half moons in her skin. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him to shut up, to remind him that he was nothing more than a junior crew member who should have stayed out of her business. But she couldn't, because the truth was he had been right. And knowing that she had destroyed herself, that no one had to lift a finger to ruin her because she had done all the work on her own, that was worse than anything he could have said. The security officers led her through a private hallway, one reserved for employees entering or exiting the restricted areas of the airport. She had walked this hallway 100 times before, never once considering what it would feel like to walk it under these circumstances. It was suffocating. The walls felt tighter, the air heavier, the reality unbearable, but then she reached the doors. The employee exit. Her breath hitched. Beyond these doors, she wasn't a flight attendant anymore. Beyond these doors, she was nothing. She hesitated just for a second, just long enough for one of the officers to glance at her, but she couldn't move. She had spent so long believing she was untouchable, so long building a career she thought was indestructible, and now all of it had vanished in the span of a single flight. It didn't feel real. It felt like a nightmare she was about to wake up from, except she wasn't. This was happening. This was real. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. Cold air hit her instantly, the contrast between the sterile airport interior and the harsh outside world making her skin prickle. The security officers didn't push her forward, didn't force her to move. They didn't need to, because she had already lost. She stepped out. The doors shut behind her, and just like that, Emily Harrington was gone. For a long moment, she just stood there, her breath shaky, her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her bag. She had nowhere to go, no flight to check into, no crew briefing, no passengers to look down on, no airline uniform that made her feel powerful, nothing. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, the device suddenly feeling heavier than it should. She unlocked the screen, half expecting a message from someone. Anyone. Offering her a second chance, telling her that this was all a misunderstanding, that she could fix this, thus. But there was nothing. No calls, no texts. Nothing but a single email notification from corporate. Subject, finalized termination. Notice Emily's breath shuddered. Her legs felt weak, her vision blurred slightly as she read the words over and over again, but they never changed. She was done. Her phone vibrated in her hand. Another notification, an update to her employee profile. She scrolled down, her stomach twisting into knots. Status terminated. It was over. It wasn't just her job. It was her entire career. There was no coming back from this, no appeals, no second chances. Her breath hitched again, but this time she couldn't stop it. The walls she had so carefully built around herself, the pride that had kept her standing tall, the arrogance that had convinced her she was above everyone else, all of it shattered. And for the first time, she let it happen. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent, unrelenting, unstoppable. She had spent years deciding who deserved respect and who didn't. And now, for the first time, she realized she had never deserved it herself. Emily Harrington sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stared out at the airport she had once ruled like a queen. But she wasn't royalty anymore. She wasn't anyone anymore. Just a disgraced former flight attendant, sitting in a parking lot, drowning in the wreckage of her own arrogance. The cold, suffocating weight of finality settled deep into her chest as she tried to process it all. The escort out of the building, the whispered conversations she had passed, the humiliating final walk through the terminal where not a single person had looked at her with sympathy. Just indifference. Because no one cared. Not about her. Not about the years she had given to the airline. Not about the fact that she had dedicated her life to this job, only to have it ripped away from her in a single flight. She had walked through that airport every day for years, commanding respect, controlling first class like it was her personal empire, making the rules, setting the tone. And now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a ghost in a uniform that no longer belonged to her, a woman with nowhere to go. Her throat tightened. She had spent so long believing she was untouchable, believing that she was the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. But who was she without that power, without the title, without the uniform? Who was Emily Harrington when she was no longer the person standing at the front of first class, dictating who deserved to be there? Subscribe and follow the channel for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what happens next. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, unlocking the screen with stiff, jerky movements, her breath catching when she saw the reality staring back at her. No missed calls, no messages from colleagues, no desperate pleas from anyone telling her that this was all a mistake, that corporate had reconsidered, that there was a way to fix this. Nothing. Just an email from HR confirming her termination, another from airline security detailing the return process for her badge and uniform, and one final notification that sent a violent shudder through her entire body. An alert from the National Aviation Registry. She tapped it with numb fingers, her stomach twisting, her vision blurring as the words burned into her mind. Her name, her employment record, her termination marked with a flag. The airline hadn't just fired her, they had buried her. She wouldn't be getting another job, not here, not anywhere. Not after this. Every airline that did even the most basic background check would see it. Passenger misconduct, physical assault, immediate termination, she was blacklisted, permanently. A harsh, choked sound escaped her lips, half a sob, half a disbelieving laugh. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had spent years fighting her way up the ranks, outlasting younger, fresher recruits, proving that she was the best, the one in charge, the woman who dictated how things were run. And now? Now she had been tossed aside like she was nothing. She had thought herself powerful, untouchable, but Kieran Ross had destroyed her with nothing more than patience. He had watched her collapse under the weight of her own arrogance and let her do it. That was the worst part. Not the firing, not the public humiliation, not even the final words that had sealed her fate. It was the fact that she had been given so many chances to stop, to course correct, to back down. And she hadn't. She had doubled down, again and again, and now she was paying for it in the worst way imaginable. Her vision blurred again as she stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, but the woman staring back at her wasn't the Emily Harrington she had been just hours ago. That woman was gone. This woman, this version of herself, was a stranger. The career-driven, no-nonsense flight attendant who had once walked into every shift with an air of superiority, who had looked down on passengers who didn't meet her silent standards, who had ruled her cabin with an iron fist. She had vanished somewhere between that slap and the moment Kieran Ross had uttered the words that had shattered her entire existence. You don't belong in the sky. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She had never truly understood what it meant to lose everything until now. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, for a way to fix this, to make it all disappear. There had to be something she could do. Maybe an appeal. Maybe she could reach out to an old connection, find someone who could undo this. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no fixing this. Not this time. This wasn't just a bad day. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the end. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done. The years of entitlement, the power plays, the small humiliations she had inflicted on others, the passengers she had treated like inconveniences rather than people. Had any of them felt like this? This utter soul-crushing emptiness? This realization that they had been dismissed, discarded, stripped of their dignity? Had she made them feel like this? The thought made her stomach churn because she knew the answer. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't look at it. She already knew what it was, another confirmation. another reminder that she was no longer part of this world. Instead, she let her head rest against the steering wheel, her breath shaky, her mind blank. For so long, she had defined herself by her job, by the power she held over others, and now, with all of it gone, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. She had spent years believing she was the judge, the gatekeeper, the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. But in the end, she had been the one who didn't belong. The irony was almost laughable. Almost. She sat there for what felt like hours, watching as the airport she had once owned faded into the background. The people inside would move on. The flights would continue. The airline would replace her by tomorrow. Nothing had changed except for her, and no one would even remember her name. The lesson from this story is one of accountability, humility, and the consequences of unchecked arrogance. Emily Harrington believed she was untouchable, that her authority in the sky gave her the right to treat others however she pleased. For years, she wielded her position with entitlement, dismissing, belittling, and controlling passengers based on her own biases. But power is never absolute, and when she finally crossed the line with the wrong person, her downfall was swift and merciless. This story serves as a reminder that respect is not dictated by authority, but earned through one's actions. No title, no position, no years of experience can protect someone from the consequences of their choices. Emily wasn't ruined by an outside force. She destroyed herself. And in the end, she was forced to confront a reality she had ignored for years. She had built her career on superiority, but when stripped of her title, she had nothing left. The true test of character isn't in how we treat those above us, but in how we treat those we perceive as beneath us.